I would guess that for the average person, not implying that any of you are average, of course, that the word joy evokes thoughts of energetic, high-level activity, high-spiritedness. And what probably comes to mind when you hear the word joy are revelers at Mardi Gras, newly wedded couples beaming as they exchange their vows, Pentecostal worshipers belting out hymns, homesick soldiers disembarking after a long tour of duty, a student rushing home to tell his parents that he has won a full scholarship to the college of his choice, or perhaps a player leaping to his feet after winning the final pot in the World Series of Poker. That's joy. And all of these are, to be sure, significant moments. And they do illuminate one aspect of this most positive of human emotions. But if we limit our application of the word joy to these more overt displays of heightened emotion, some of us may not be receptive to the joyful possibilities that infiltrate into our own lives. And others may never develop an appreciation for the many ways in which joy can and does manifest itself in more subtle but still meaningful ways. Now, in Webster's dictionary, synonyms for joy include delight and gaiety, terms which again give the impression that joy is this heightened emotion with overtones of exuberance and elation. But then that raises an important issue for me. Some human beings are simply not given to these kinds of moods. Now, we're not necessarily repressed, mind you, but we tend to be more emotionally understated, our affective status leaning toward the reserved. And so the bandwidth of our emotions are narrow, and we are basically unfamiliar with the peaks and the valleys that other people seem to experience. But does that mean that for people like us, such a felicitous feeling as joy will never be realized, never be available for we, the more even-tempered members of the human species? And I myself do belong to that latter class of persons, a person whose temperature runs in that narrow gamut from cool to lukewarm. And so naturally, a poem like this one from John Tagliabue strikes a responsive chord in me. And this poem has a cumbersome title. Moderation is not a negation of intensity, but helps avoid monotony. It reads in part like this. No one, he says, can have poetry or dances or prayers or climaxes all day. The ordinary blankness of little dramatic consciousness, that's good for the health sometimes. Because only Dostoevsky can be Dostoevskian at such long, tumultuous stretches. Look at what all that intensity did to poor great Van Gogh. So linger, lounge, scrounge, be stupid. That does not take much centering of one's forces. As wise Walt Whitman said, lounge and invite the soul. Get enough sleep. Be a dumbbell for a few minutes at least, because we don't want Sunday church bells ringing constantly. So the fact is that there are some in the world who are transported by the bright and lively works of John Philip Sousa, while others are moved by the gentler cadences of Erik Satie, or the interlude that we just heard a few moments ago. Is one listener's joy any more real, more genuine than the others? You know, the philosopher James Carse has commented that our hungering for the big experience, that sort of sudden insight, that dazzling vision, that heart-stopping ecstasy that Sylvia Boorstein craved, this hunger may be precisely what prevents us from savoring and tasting those daily morsels, each of which makes a small but significant contribution to a joyful life. Joy doesn't have to come in big packages accompanied by clanging bells and shrill whistles. Bertrand Russell, one of the 20th century's most revered intellectuals, said that a happy life must be, to a great extent, a quiet life, because it's only in the atmosphere of quiet that true joy can live. So it seems that there are any number of pathways by which joy can work its way into our lives. And we have the ability to set the stage for its entrance. Life's rare moments of crowning success and spiritual inspiration provide us with this elevated sense of positive emotion, but there is also joy to be had, as Mary Oliver puts it, in the ordinary, in the very drab daily presentations. However, to be touched by this emotion, we must become a little more intentional in our efforts to develop the same loving attention to detail that the poet possesses. And so one of the first and most obvious steps we should take is to just simply slow down, reduce our pace, learn, as Whitman said, to saunter, giving ourselves a little extra time to tune in to the world around us. Now, our fast-paced convenience culture has trained us, as we say, to eat on the run. But that habit of haste does not provide us with much in the way of gustatorial pleasure. And while a quick drive through the countryside may be pleasant enough, a walk, a bike ride, that will provide much more sensory stimulation. And so we must give ourselves permission to linger, to pause long enough to inhale the scent of the spring humus, to savor the flash of the passing goldfinch. And you know what? As I have learned over many, many years, it helps to have a dog. As this particular man, described by his neighbor Robert Fulgham, demonstrates to us. Fulgham writes, "Almost every evening I see Sam walking, his old dog with him and a newly acquired puppy. It's a pretty common scene, an ordinary event in most neighborhoods. You can almost set your clock by his reliable rhythm, coming in by 10, going back by 10:30. Winter, spring, summer, fall, rain, snow, clouds, sunshine. Sam walks his dogs." Now, he said to me that the dogs keep him doing something important for himself. Now, the old dog finds his leash every evening and stands by the door waiting. And the old dog, he's motivated by his lower intestine and his bladder. The young dog frolics through the house, yapping and wriggling, driven by enthusiasm for every opportunity for action and adventure. But Sam himself, he's compelled by a need, as he tells his wife, to get some fresh air. And whatever he calls it, she understands where he's going and why, and while he's out of the house, she will do the dishes, for the same reason that he goes out with the dogs. It's a sacred habit in their household, a reflective time. We might call it a spiritual discipline that they both have. And Sam says to me that when he goes out on these walks, he settles the affairs of the day. He thinks about tomorrow. He calms down from all the busyness in his life. He notices the weather, the seasons, the trees, the stars, and he thinks about all the big stuff. When my neighbor walks the dogs, he performs a ritual act of sacer simplicatus, to use the Latin, sacred simplicity. Walking the dog, that is in truth a ritual of renewal and revival on an intimate scale, a small rebirth of well-being on a daily basis. Quiet joy. A second factor to take into consideration as we strive to introduce more joy into our lives is to break through the habit of always wanting. That's a killjoy, if there ever was one. Another Buddhist writer named Stephen Levine tells us that it is this unquenchable desire for things to be other than they are that creates discontent and ultimately suffering. Paradoxically, the seeking of pleasure may represent the greatest barrier to joy because, as Levine puts it, once that pleasure has been obtained, then there arises the desire to keep it, nothing wanting to mar it or to break through it. So happiness, he says, is found in the spaciousness of not wanting. Now, wanting is not something we can simply decide that we're not going to indulge in. To one degree or another, we are all constituted to be desirous beings. But then again, the design of our culture keeps us in this almost constant state of craving. Not only do we want the things that we legitimately need to live decently, but we hunger for all sorts of things that do not contribute anything to the sum total of our happiness. Robert Frank, writing a number of years ago in the magazine The American Prospect, identifies the nub of this problem. Well, Frank taught economics at Cornell University, and he argued that our quest for positional goods, that's a major factor conditioning the typical American's behavior. And when he uses that term, positional goods, he means the products and the services that people think that they need because others that they are exposed to already have those things. This culturally conditioned desire to match the material lifestyle of others in our peer group, or even of a Donald Trump, that's what creates this near constant state of craving and chronic discontent. And this disorder affects people all across the economic spectrum because, as Frank explains, additional spending by the rich shifts the frame of reference that defines what the near rich consider to be necessary or desirable. And then they too, the near rich, spend more. And this shifts the frame of reference to those who are just below the near rich, and so on all the way down the income ladder. The point is, it's very difficult for a desirous person, a craving person, to feel any kind of real joy, because joy presupposes that one already senses that they have enough and then some. Indeed, to be joyful, one cannot simultaneously feel that they are deprived or that they are needy. There must be this sense of contentment, being at ease with the way things are. And then, like Sylvia Boorstein relaxing on that cold bench in the moist fog, we experience a kind of a gratitude for where we are and what we're doing. So remember that epiphany she had there. If she ever really saw that luminescent tree, once it was gone, she would immediately begin hungering for a comparable experience. Nothing else would have satisfied her. Far better to cultivate the quiet joy of contentment, the most exotic mind state of them all. Now, a third means by which we can cultivate joy in our lives is to develop a more genuine appreciation for the good fortune and the accomplishments of other people. You know, it's all too typical for people in a highly competitive environment such as ours to feel envious or resentful towards someone who has obtained something valuable that we ourselves lack. But what would it be like to be smitten with real honest happiness, not only owing to our own fortunate circumstances, but the fortunate circumstances that visit in the lives of others as well? And if this were to happen to us, we would be experiencing what is called sympathetic joy, altruistic joy, something we experience when we have developed this kind of emotional resonance with other people. And that's a wonderful capacity to have, for as the Dalai Lama has observed, if we put other people's good fortune on a par with our own, our chances of feeling delight are immeasurably increased. Now, most of us are at least passingly acquainted with that kind of a feeling, because the blessings that are experienced by our spouse or by our next door neighbor or by our children, that can strike a responsive chord in us as well. We feel good for them. But the wider we cast that net of appreciation, the more joy we are able to bring into our lives, to harvest for ourselves. Sylvia Boorstein again, she gives the cogent example of a Hall of Fame football player by the name of Jerry Rice. Some of you probably remember Jerry Rice. He set numerous records as a wide receiver, won several Super Bowl rings when he was playing for the San Francisco 49ers. Now, shortly after his induction into the Hall of Fame, he was asked by a sportcaster to identify the single most memorable moment of his long career. And his response showed why Jerry Rice was regarded by teammates and opponents alike as not only one of the game's greatest players, but also one of its truest gentlemen. And Rice told the sportscaster, you know, that moment, that crowning moment in my career had to have been in Super Bowl 23 when, with less than 2 minutes remaining, Joe Montana, the quarterback, threw a pass that John Taylor caught in the end zone, a play that clinched the game for the 49ers. And when John Taylor caught that pass, Rice remembered, I felt as if it were me. And so we have an instructive example there of sympathetic or altruistic joy. Now, the discipline of positive psychology has begun to examine and to test some of these ideas to see whether there's empirical evidence that supports the points that I've been trying to make this morning. And so in her book, Positivity, Barbara Fredrickson, distinguished professor of psychology at the University of North Carolina, she argues that, for the most part, research does confirm some of these ideas. And she insists that we can choose to experience positive emotions. We can choose to do so. It's simply a matter, she says, of putting ourselves in the proper frame of mind to do so. Now, nothing novel, nothing exciting really needs to be added to our lives because, she says, it is out of our ordinary daily transactions that positive emotions, joy, contentment, appreciation, serenity, grow, and over time, they increase in their frequency. Of course, people do need some guidance here because there is this habit of wanting, this desirousness that has become so deeply rooted in the American psyche. And so Friedrichsen offers some simple, fairly obvious suggestions that would help to perhaps mitigate some of that desirousness. She says, become less self-centered, become more spacious. Pay attention to kindness. Play to your strengths. Whatever it is you do best, do your best in that particular capacity. Follow through. She advises also that we should spend more time outdoors because few things do more to restore or strengthen our spirits than communing with the natural world. Pretty obvious. And then, of course, bring your attention back to the present moment again and again and again. Don't allow yourself to be constantly distracted by cell phones or anything else like that. Stephen Lewis says, it's between the bread and the butter that the greatest moments of life are lived. And Blaney Colmore, a recently retired Episcopal priest, seconds that thought, saying, my religion, remember he's an Episcopal, my religion has become learning to pay attention to the endless details as they unfold, and to try as best I can to show in my life how thrilled I am to have been here. Joyfulness, Barbara Fredrickson believes, is not a single exceptional emotion, but it's rather a more generalized state of being that is realized through the gentle encouragement and faithful cultivation of many positive moments. And so if one really wants to be happy, the key is to focus on these day-to-day feelings, and perhaps to say to yourself every morning, this is the day I have been looking for. And over time, this practice will produce an enhanced outlook and make it possible, as Fredrickson says, to become the best version of ourselves. And isn't that ultimately what life really challenges us to do? To be the best version of ourselves? To become a cheerful, appreciative, and generous person rather than a disappointed, morose version of ourselves? And it is undeniable that persistent difficulties, a series of hard knocks, can lead to a jaundiced outlook. This doesn't have to become a permanent fixture of our personality, because everyone has the latent capacity for quiet joy that we can lean into. And when we do, in time, that better self will emerge and take a bow when we weren't even looking. Blessed be, and amen.